Hello everybody and welcome to part 8 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey begins. We start in space with our space station, the Aristotle. Once again the science lab is bursting at the seams with science, so once again we're going to get that transmitting down to Kerbin. Hopefully it'll be enough to get us some new goodies, and once that's done we're going to refill that lab with the experiment storage container that's just attached to the side of the module there. Back on Kerbin, and it turns out, yes, I do have enough to unlock something new. Get ourselves started on that 9th tier of the tech tree. For those of you who are new to this series, self-imposed restriction, I am going through the tech tree one layer at a time. Now for this, I've got a new mission coming up. I'd like to get something I can use on that. Looking through all the options, the RTG, the radioisotope thermoelectric generator, I just about remembered that, catches my eye because we're going to be going quite deep into space, maybe where solar panels aren't quite as much use, without meaning to give too much away this early. So we select that, hoping it will be of some use. And as luck would have it, the first window to open up is for that very mission. So we are blasting off from the KSC with one of my Brunel Mark 1s, and we have 3 brand new Kerbals aboard. In the command seat for today is our new pilot, Grayfrid Kerman. It might be pronounced Graffrid, but I find Grayfrid slips off the tongue a little easier, so I'm going to stick with that. And she is joined by our new scientist, Jeblorf, and our new engineer, Erison Kerman. It's a bit of a baptism of fire for these guys, but, well, the manned part of this mission is pretty straightforward, so the other Kerbals decided to give it to them. That, and I think the other Kerbals might have been hungover. I think Bill's been brewing his questionably legal gin again. Also, we didn't use that new part in the end, which kind of irritates me, but I did a lot of testing to find a suitable vehicle, and it turns out we didn't need it, so, yeah, it wasn't included. But enough about what isn't on this mission, let's look at what is as our Kerbals reach space and deploy that fairing. Now, after the success of our Moho probe mission, at least so far, I've decided I'm going to launch another one of these gravity probes, but instead of going closer into Kerbal, this one's going to be much further out. We're going to duel with this one, and the first job of our green recruits is to boost this thing up to an orbit of about 800,000 metres. Once we've reached our 800-kilometre apoapsis, our Kerbals circularise their orbit, and now we can release our probe and its booster. So we extend the solar panels on the booster stage. That's going to power the whole assembly for now. The power arrangements for the probe are a little bit different. I'll discuss that a little bit later. And then we can extend the antenna because we're going to have to deploy that before we get too far away from Kerbal, so might as well be now. And with that, our Kerbals have finished their task. And for a first mission, I think they've done a bang-up job. So with their mission complete, it's time for our new recruits to head for home, and once again I'm not too fussed about where I land this command module, so we're just going to burn straight for re-entry, stopping of course along the way to ditch the adapter we've picked up along the way, as well as the service module, and then they slip into the atmosphere, ready for the praise and adulation of their colleagues. Well, maybe not Jebediah. I think he's gone back for more gin. But anyway, after an uneventful re-entry, our Kerbals come down, not too far away from the KSC continent, actually. I've had a couple of lucky ones like that. I really should start trying to do them on purpose, but as I said, I'm not too fussed at the moment, and it's not too long before our Kerbals find themselves splashing down in Kerbal's vast blue oceans. Meanwhile, in space, and I'd say that phrase about 15 times an episode if I thought I could get away with it, we have to get our little probe and booster assembly ready for its transfer burn. We start, of course, by planning our manoeuvre. For this, once again, I'm using Alex Moon's transfer planner, link in the description. So I input the values from the planner, and what do you know, I get an encounter first time, which doesn't normally happen to me. But anyway, we set about fine-tuning it and getting ourselves a nice, good encounter, which is going to put us onto a good orbit, and then it's time for us to get in position and perform the burn itself. Now, of course, there are some differences between this probe and the one we sent to Moho. For starters, the most obvious one is those fuel tanks. It kind of looks like the Moho probe's been taking too many steroids. But no, that's because we're going with a different propulsion system. You'll also notice the graphite radiator on one side of the probe, and that's just going to deal with any extra heating, because we're not using ion propulsion this time, We're using nuclear propulsion. We're using one of the additional nuclear engines which comes with KSP Interstellar. We're using the Candle. It's the 0.625 meter engine that comes with that. And this isn't just going to provide us with our thrust, it's also going to provide us with our electricity, because it has an RTG sort of built into it, so we don't need to worry about solar panels or other RTGs or anything like that. One of the upshots of this is that our Delta V margins are a lot tighter, unlike on the Moho mission where we could throw it about a bit and keep watching, because by the end of that mission I've given up all care and concern about Delta V efficiency. But no, on this one we're going to have to be a lot stricter, a lot more disciplined. To that end, we are actually keeping the booster stage with us until we get to Joule. We're going to use some of the leftover Delta V there to help us manoeuvre. And on the probe itself, we're going to end up with about 3,000 metres per second of spare Delta V just to manoeuvre about the place once we're in the orbit of Joule. Also, that radiator does get very hot. I mean, it does. The temperature gets very close to the exploding stage, but don't worry, I've tested it. It's fine. It's all good. With our main burn complete, we have to make some slight adjustments because while the planning was pretty much spot on, the implementation not so much. But we get that rectified pretty quickly and easily, and then it's just a case of watching our probe fly away on its nearly 3-year journey to Joule. But we've got plenty to be getting on with in the meantime. Now, we've been doing quite a bit of fast forwarding to get to today's mission, so it's time once again to check on our space station, check on the science lab, and what do you know, once again it's full of science. So we get that transmitting. We don't have enough this time to pick up any new slots on the tech tree, but there's nothing I really want, and I don't think I'd want to spend it straight away anyway. So with that done, let's see what's next. So we've had our departure, now it's time to see about getting our arrival, and we are back at Moho with our probe, the Larunda. I haven't thought of a name for my other probe yet. I think I'm kind of going to have to, because I've sort of set the precedent with this one, but anyway, it's time to bring this probe home. Once again, the first step is to plan the transfer burn. Once again, Alex Moon in the description. Now, this one isn't quite so simple. I don't get quite as lucky with the transfer. I do have to do some fiddling about to get a decent approach to Kerbin, but before too long we do get ourselves a good encounter, and then it's just a case of positioning ourselves ready for our burn. The burn itself was a little bit tricky because as we approached the manoeuvre node, I noticed that Moho was about to move in front of Kerbal, and of course that would kill the sunlight, kill our power, and kill our thrust. So I guessed that it would be in front of Kerbal for about 15 minutes, so I added 15 minutes onto our burn time, used that as a guide to when to start our burn, and in the end it worked out well. We get a good encounter with Kerbin without any real need for any adjustments afterwards. So all that's left for us to do really is sit back and watch as our probe begins its short-ish journey back to Kerbin. We don't have anything else going on at the moment, so we're going to follow our probe in on its little journey. One mistake I did make was that I got an encounter on the far side of Kerbin, but I forgot that because we're raising our orbit, we're going to approach Kerbin from the other direction, if you catch my drift. So I wanted an encounter on the near side compared to where we were, but, you know, it's educational. I make these mistakes so you don't have to. It's an informative balls up. Anyway, I do consider doing the correction burn straight away, but then I decide that doesn't really make a lot of sense. We're going too fast, so I decide to burn off as much speed as is practical at this point and then perform that correction manoeuvre. It just gets us going the right way around Kerbin, means we don't have to use too much Delta V, although I'm not that fussed about using excess Delta V at the moment. I just want to get the damn thing back to Kerbin, but means we don't have to use too much to get into our desired orbit, the orbit we want to end up in. As we approach Kerbin, I begin the orbital insertion burn. I don't set up a manoeuvre node for this. I know roughly how long it's going to take us, and I'm not too fussed about how we end up. I just want to get us an orbit and then sort of work things out from there. We do get an orbit. I mean, we're well past our periapsis, but I decide to keep burning from here, just to reduce that orbit down, make sure we don't spend a ridiculous amount of time just in one orbit. Halfway through, we get an encounter with the moon, which I probably should have taken because it would have roughly halved our inclination and sped things up a little bit later on, but I'm pretty single-minded in my approach by this point. I think you can see what I mean about not really caring about Delta V usage. Anyway, we get our orbit down to something I consider reasonable, and then it's time to plan our plane change manoeuvre. This is a hefty old manoeuvre, but with the orbit we have, we're orbiting slowly enough that doesn't really matter. We perform the plane change manoeuvre. We do have to make a slight adjustment a bit further round in the orbit, but it's just a tiny little thing. It takes 9 seconds with ion engines. So with our orbital inclination sorted, it's time to start bringing that orbit down further, down to our target of 600,000 metres or thereabouts. We start by bringing our periapsis down, and then we have to start the long process of bringing our apoapsis down as well. This takes us several passes around the planet, but we do eventually get it there, and that's where we're going to leave our probe just for the moment. So we have about 2,400 science just sat in orbit above Kerbin, and it's not doing anyone any good there, so we need to do something about that. And to that end, we are blasting off from the KSC here with one of my Mark II shuttles. Valentina is in the command seat for this one, and she is joined by our scientist Bob, who will be overseeing the transportation of our precious science cargo. Also, Jebediah and Bill not in management's good books at the moment for some reason. Anyway, all we have in the cargo bay of this shuttle at the moment is our standard docking equipment and some fuel for refueling the probe. Now, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the probe. I don't have any missions planned, and I'm trying to work out where I'd use it, but I'm having a bit of difficulty. But it just seems like a handy thing to have around. It's got a ridiculous amount of Delta V. I'm sort of hedging my bets. If we don't need to use it in the future, we can always just crash it back down into Kerbin. Anyway, with our ship in orbit, Valentina and Bob can start planning their manoeuvres, and it turns out I timed our launch from the KSC surprisingly well. We go pretty much straight from our plane correction manoeuvre into our intercept manoeuvre, which makes a nice change from some of the launches very early on in this series. Having completed our interception manoeuvre, it's not too long before we're arriving in close proximity to the Larunda, and now we can start to dock. The Larunda itself doesn't have any manoeuvring thrusters, so we're just going to have to get that pointing in the right direction and then manoeuvre the shuttle around to dock with it. As usual, the docking port in this Mark II shuttle is connected to a robotic hinge, so we can angle that upwards to help with the docking, and it's not too long before we are safely attached to our quarry. Our first job is to transfer that xenon gas across, get the probe completely refueled, should we decide to do anything with it in the future, and then we can detach from the probe. But this probe, like most of the probes I've done in this series, has a detachable science package, so we're just going to take that off and leave the probe in orbit here. With the science package stowed safely in the cargo bay, it's time for us to leave our probe and head to the space station, because we're not going to take all this science back down with us. We're going to take 3/4 of it back down. We're going to give the rest to the space station for it to process on board our orbital science lab. Once again, we get quite lucky with the manoeuvre node. We're almost exactly where we need to be to perform our rendezvous manoeuvre, and with that done, it's not too long before the space station is in sight. We bring ourselves into the space station carefully, of course. With that new interplanetary vehicle docked to the space station, it does add a little bit of a complicating factor. You have to be careful, especially to avoid those storage containers that are attached to the vehicle. But in the end, we do manage to find ourselves docked safe and sound. Transferring the science across is an absolute doddle. Because we're transferring to an experiment storage container, we can just use the transfer science feature in KSP, and with that done, it's time for Valentina and Bob to make their way home. By this point, our fuel tanks were starting to run a little low, but I wasn't overly concerned. I knew we had enough fuel to get back to Kerbin comfortably, but this is where today's final instructive cock-up occurs. Now, I very rarely deorbit my Mark II shuttle with this little fuel in it, or anything close to it, in fact. And if something has the same surface area, but a lot less mass, it's going to slow down a lot quicker in the atmosphere, which I completely failed to compensate for. And I have a degree in this stuff. Oh god. Anyway, for a moment it looks like we won't even reach the KSC continent, but I realise what's happening quickly enough. I lower our nose and we do comfortably reach dry land, and as we touch down softly but slightly red-faced on Kerbin's grasslands, that will bring today's episode to an end. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. Next episode we have some much bigger craft to contend with, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.